and make sure to engage in comments. And share this video to your friends and story lovers. And click on the subscribe button on the screen to subscribe to Inquisco for more real and true stories like this. I never thought I'd find myself at an office function, especially one filled with polished executives and their equally polished partners. Yet there I was standing in the middle of a sleek, softly lit banquet hall, clutching a flute of champagne that I hadn't even taken a sip from. My husband, Daniel, had been preparing for this night for weeks. He wasn't one to obsess over his job. But this promotion was different. Was the kind of step up that could shift the trajectory of his career. So when he casually mentioned that his boss, Richard Coleman, wanted spouses to attend, I knew I had to make an impression. I spent hours agonizing over what to wear, finally settling on a fitted black dress that felt elegant, but not overdone. Daniel had even smiled when he saw me in it, murmuring, "You look perfect." It was one of the rare compliments I'd received from him lately. The night started predictably enough. Daniel introduced me to a string of his colleagues, and I played the role of the supportive wife, smiling, nodding, laughing at the appropriate moments. It wasn't until Richard Coleman himself walked into the room that the atmosphere seemed to shift. He was taller than I'd expected, with a commanding presence that made the room seem smaller. His salt and pepper hair was impeccably styled, and his tailored suit fit like a second skin. Daniel stiffened slightly when Richard approached, a nervous smile flickering across his face. "Daniel?" Richard said, his voice smooth and deliberate. "You must be Olivia." I extended my hand, but instead of shaking it, Richard took it lightly, his touch warm and firm. "It's a pleasure to meet you," he said, his eyes locking onto mine in a way that made my breath hitch. "The pleasure's mine," I managed, my voice steady despite the sudden quickening of my pulse. For the next hour, Richard flitted around the room, making rounds, charming everyone in his orbit. But every so often I'd catch his gaze lingering on me. At first I thought I was imagining it. After all, why would a man like him notice me? But the looks were unmistakable, brief, measured, and just long enough to make me question my own composure. By the time dinner was served, I felt like I was walking on a tightrope. Daniel was engrossed in a conversation about quarterly reports, his attention firmly fixed on impressing the company's higher UPS. I sat beside him, nodding along absent-mindedly when I felt a presence behind me. "Olivia," Richard's voice came softly. "Almost too close. May I borrow you for a moment?" Daniel glanced up, startled, but Richard's request didn't leave much room for refusal. I stood smoothing the hem of my dress and followed him to a quieter corner of the room. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said, though his tone suggested he didn't particularly care if he was. "Not at all," I replied, my voice catching slightly. "I just wanted to say how impressed I am with your husband's work." He continued, his eyes fixed on mine. "And how fortunate he is to have someone like you supporting him." The compliment caught me off guard. I murmured a polite thank you. But I couldn't ignore the way his gaze seemed to linger. "You must have a way of keeping him grounded," Richard added, leaning slightly closer. His cologne was subtle but intoxicating, a mix of cedarwood and something warm I couldn't place. "Daniel works hard," I said, trying to steer the conversation back to safer territory. "He does," Richard agreed, his lips curving into a faint smile. "But I imagine it's easier when you have someone worth working hard for." The weight of his words hung in the air, and I felt my cheeks flush. Before I could respond, Daniel's voice called out from across the room, breaking the moment like a snapped string. I turned grateful for the distraction, and Richard stepped back, his expression unreadable. "Enjoy the rest of the evening, Olivia," he said smoothly before walking away. I returned to Daniel's side, my heart still racing, and plastered on a smile as though nothing had happened. But as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The evening continued, but I found it hard to focus on anything Daniel or anyone else was saying. My mind kept replaying those brief moments with Richard. The way his voice dipped just enough to feel intimate. The faint scent of his cologne. The way his words carried a weight that lingered long after he left my side. The function had moved from the dining area to a more casual, cocktail setting. Guests were milling around, drinks in hand, and the chatter grew louder as the night wore on. Daniel was deep in conversation with two of his colleagues, laughing at some joke I didn't catch. I excused myself to grab another glass of wine, needing a moment to collect my thoughts. As I approached the bar, I felt him before I saw him. Richard appeared at my side, his presence commanding without being overbearing. "Enjoying yourself?" he asked, his voice low enough that only I could hear. I glanced at him, careful to keep my expression neutral. "It's been a lovely evening." His lips curved into a subtle smile, and he leaned just slightly closer. I hope I didn't overstep earlier. Sometimes I can come across as direct. "No, not at all," I said quickly, though the flutter in my chest told a different story. "I meant what I said, though." He continued, his gaze steady. "You carry yourself with a grace that's rare. It's refreshing." I swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. The compliment felt too personal, too pointed, and yet I couldn't deny the thrill that ran through me. "That's very kind of you," I managed, taking a sip of my wine to hide my unease. We stood there for a moment, the noise of the crowd fading into the background. It was as if the world had narrowed down to just the two of us. I could feel the tension building, like a taut string stretched to its limit. "Your husband is lucky," Richard said finally. His tone softer now, I looked up at him, caught off guard by the sincerity in his voice. Before I could say anything, Daniel's voice called out from across the room, shattering the moment. "There you are," he said, walking over with a broad smile. "I was wondering where you'd gone." "I was just grabbing another drink," I replied, my voice steady, but my hands gripping the glass tightly. Richard nodded at Daniel, his Polish demeanor back in place. "You have a remarkable wife, Daniel. Don't let her slip away from you." The comment hung in the air, and Daniel laughed nervously, not quite sure how to respond. "I know I'm lucky," he said, placing a hand on my back. Richard's eyes flicked to mine for the briefest moment before he stepped back. "Enjoy the rest of your evening," he said smoothly, disappearing into the crowd. I could barely focus after that. Daniel didn't seem to notice anything amiss, too caught up in the excitement of the night. But I couldn't ignore the way my heart raced whenever Richard was near, or the way his words seemed to echo in my mind long after he'd spoken them. Later, as the event began winding down, I found myself alone on the terrace, The cool night air was a welcome relief. From the stifling heat of the banquet hall, and I leaned against the railing, staring out at the city lights. I didn't hear him approach, but I knew it was him before he even spoke. Taking a moment for yourself. Richard's voice was quiet. Almost gentle, I turned to see him standing a few feet away, his hands in his pockets. "It's a beautiful night," I said. Avoiding his gaze, "It is." He agreed, stepping closer. "Though, I imagine it's difficult to enjoy it with everything on your mind." I glanced at him, startled. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, his eyes never leaving mine. "You seem distracted. Like you're carrying the weight of something unspoken." I laughed softly, shaking my head. "You're quite perceptive, aren't you?" "It's part of the job," he said, his tone light but his expression serious. "But it's more than that. You strike me as someone who feels deeply, but doesn't always say what they're feeling." The words hit too close to home, and I looked away, focusing on the skyline instead of the man standing next to me. "Sometimes it's easier that way," I said finally. "Easier, maybe," he replied, stepping closer but not always better. The silence between us grew heavier, charged with an unspoken tension that was impossible to ignore. I felt his presence beside me, the warmth of him, and for a moment, I wondered what it would feel like to let myself fall into whatever this was. But then I heard the sound of footsteps approaching, and the spell was broken. One of Daniel's colleagues appeared, calling out a cheerful goodbye as he passed by. Richard stepped back, his expression unreadable. "Good night, Olivia," he said softly, his voice lingering in the air long after he walked away. I stayed on the terrace for a long time after that, the cool breeze doing little to calm the storm inside me. The evening was finally coming to an end. Guests began trickling out, their laughter and goodbyes echoing through the now quieter banquet hall. Daniel was still inside, caught up in a conversation with his supervisor, leaving me on my own again. I stood by the large windows overlooking the city, absently tracing the rim of my empty wine glass and trying to study my thoughts. I told myself I was overreacting, that this was nothing more than an office party where the boss had been slightly more attentive than necessary. But no matter how many times I tried to convince myself, I couldn't ignore the way my heart skipped every time I replayed our interactions. The sound of soft footsteps made me glance over my shoulder. Richard was standing there, his tie slightly loosened now, his Polish demeanor softened by the late hour. His presence filled the room as easily as it had when I first met him, though now it felt different, intimate, still not ready to call it a night. He asked, his voice carrying a warmth that felt almost dangerous. "I needed a moment," I said quietly. He nodded, stepping closer, but keeping a respectful distance. "It's been a long evening." "It has," I replied, though I wasn't sure if I was referring to the night or the emotions swirling inside me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us, heavy with words neither of us dared to say. Then, almost imperceptibly, Richard moved closer, closing the distance between us until we were just a breath apart. "I shouldn't do this," he murmured, his voice low and filled with something that sounded like regret. I turned to face him fully, my pulse quickening. "Then don't." His eyes locked onto mine, and for the first time all night, I felt completely exposed. The weight of his gaze was almost unbearable. And yet I couldn't look away. "You're extraordinary, Olivia," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "More than you know." The words hit me like a punch to the chest. I didn't know how to respond, so I didn't instead. I stood there, caught in the gravitational pull of a moment I knew I shouldn't be, and his hand reached up as if to touch my face. But he stopped himself just short, his fingers hovering inches from my skin. I could feel the warmth of him, the unspoken promise of something that could unravel everything. "Richard," I whispered, my voice trembling, and just like that, the spell broke. He stepped back, his hand falling to his side as he exhaled a shaky breath. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I shouldn't have." I shook my head, cutting him off. We stood there for a moment longer, the weight of what almost happened settling over us like a heavy fog. Then, without another word, Richard turned and walked away, leaving me standing by the window, my heart pounding and my thoughts racing. When I finally rejoined Daniel, it was his usual oblivious self, beaming with excitement over the connections he'd made that night. He wrapped an arm around me, kissing my temple in a rare display of affection. "Thank you for coming tonight," he said warmly. "It means a lot to me." I smiled, leaning into him and letting his familiar presence ground me. But as we walked out of the banquet hall together, I couldn't shake the memory of Richard's words, or the ghost of what almost was. Some lines shouldn't be crossed, I reminded myself, but even as I said it, I knew I'd carry the weight of that night with me, tucked away in the quiet corners of my mind. Click on the subscribe button on the screen to subscribe to Inquisco for more real and true stories like this.